Sometimes the strongest among us are moved by the gentlest hearts. In the harsh northern lands, a giant warrior named Ulfgrim secretly cared for an old woman who had once saved his life. Every dawn, he brought her warm broth and firewood. Halla was old and forgotten, but she had bandaged his wounds when he was just a lost boy. For months, no one knew about these quiet visits. Then one morning, his own guards came riding with axes. They had orders to kill anyone helping the witch woman. Ulfgrim stood between them and Halla, knowing it meant his death. Would the greatest warrior of his generation sacrifice everything for one frail woman's life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The longhouse of Jarl Magnus stretched across the highest ground in Ironhold Valley like a sleeping dragon. Its timber walls bore the scars of countless battles, and the great hall echoed with stories of conquest that had built this settlement into the most feared stronghold north of the frozen seas. At the head of the long oak table sat Magnus himself, grey-bearded and thick-armed, his weathered hands wrapped around a horn of mead. But it was not the Jarl who commanded the room's attention this morning. Ulfgrim Ironjaw stood 7 feet tall, even without his battle helm, his shoulders broad enough to block sunlight from the doorway. His beard fell in thick braids, adorned with iron rings, each one marking a victory that had added to his legend. When he moved, seasoned warriors stepped aside, not from fear but from respect earned through blood and honor. His reputation preceded him into every room, the man who had never retreated, never yielded, never shown mercy to those who threatened his people. The southern raiders gather again, beyond the mountain pass, Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent commanding men in battle. Our scouts report at least 300 warriors, maybe more. They remember the wealth we took from their coastal settlements last summer. Ulfgrim nodded slowly, his grey eyes fixed on the carved map spread across the table. They seek revenge, not just riches. That makes them dangerous. His voice rumbled like distant thunder, each word measured and deliberate. When do we ride? 3 days hence, when the moon is dark. You'll lead the vanguard, as always. Magnus leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Ulfgrim's face. But there's another matter. Strange reports from the village below. Talk of old women speaking to spirits, mixing potions that heal wounds too quickly to be natural. The great hall fell silent, except for the crackling of the central fire. Around the table, warriors exchanged glances, their hands unconsciously moving to the iron amulets they wore to ward off evil magic. Ulfgrim's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered behind his eyes, a memory perhaps, or a shadow of concern. Superstition, Ulfgrim said finally. Old wives' tales told by men who fear what they don't understand, perhaps. But superstition can spread like wildfire, and frightened men make poor warriors. Magnus set down his horn with a heavy thud. Keep your ears open. If there's truth to these whispers, we'll need to act before they poison our people's minds. After the war council ended, Ulfgrim walked alone through the village that sprawled beneath the longhouse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the timber houses, and the air carried the familiar scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and the salt wind from the distant fjord. Children playing in the muddy streets stopped their games to stare as he passed, their eyes wide with the kind of awe reserved for legends walking among mortals. He had earned that awe through 15 years of victories that had made Ironhold Valley wealthy and feared. His axe had cleared the mountain passes of bandits. His strategies had broken enemy shield walls, and his name was spoken in hushed tones from the ice-locked settlements in the far north to the green lands beyond the southern mountains. But today, as he walked the familiar paths of his home, those victories felt like stones in his chest. At the edge of the village, where the last houses gave way to scraggly pines and rocky ground, stood a cottage so small and weather-beaten that most visitors to Ironhold never noticed it. Smoke rose thin and grey from its chimney, and herbs hung drying from the eaves, sage wintergreen, and plants whose names were known only to those who remembered the old ways of healing. Ulfgrim paused at the edge of the clearing, his massive frame hidden behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak. Through the cottage's single window, he could see movement, the slow, careful gestures of someone preparing a meal with hands that had grown stiff with age. On the wooden table beside the window sat a collection of smooth stones, each one carved with symbols that predated the coming of the Christian priests, when healing was as much about understanding the spirit as mending the flesh. These were Halla's healing stones, and they marked her as one of the last who remembered the old knowledge. In the growing twilight, they seemed to glow with their own inner light, ancient runes that spoke of a time when warriors and healers worked together, when strength and wisdom were not enemies but allies. 23 years had passed since Ulfgrim first encountered those stones, and the memory came to him now, as vivid as the morning mist that clung to the fjord. He had been 14 then, all elbows and fury, running wild through the forest after a beating from his stepfather, ACT, man who saw weakness in any display of emotion and answered questions with the back of his hand. The bear had found him near the stream, where he had gone to wash the blood from his split lip. A massive brown she-bear, desperate with hunger after a long winter, had caught his scent and followed it through the undergrowth. Ulfgrim had no weapons save a eating knife, no experience fighting anything larger than the village boys who mocked his patched clothes and fatherless state. The bear's claws had opened 3 long furrows across his chest, and her teeth had found his shoulder before he managed to drive the small blade between her ribs. He had crawled away from her dying body, leaving a trail of blood that any tracker could have followed, and collapsed in a clearing where wild herbs grew thick around a natural spring. That was where Halla had found him. A woman already old then, her hair silver white, and her hands marked with the calluses of a lifetime spent gathering roots and grinding medicines. She had looked at his wounds with eyes that held no judgment, only the calm assessment of someone who had seen death many times and learned how to turn it away. "You're bleeding inside as well as out," she had said, her voice gentle as she cleaned the claw marks with water heated over a small fire. "The bear's anger went into you with her claws. We'll need to draw that out first, or the wounds will never heal properly." For 3 days, she had tended him in her cottage, feeding him broths made from plants he couldn't name, and telling him stories of the old days when warriors understood that true strength came not from anger, but from the courage to protect what mattered. She had pressed her healing stones against his fevered skin, speaking words in the old tongue that seemed to pull the poison from his blood and the rage from his heart. "Anger is a fire," she had told him on the morning he was strong enough to sit up and take solid food. "It can warm you when the world grows cold, or it can burn down everything you hold dear. The choice is always yours, young wolf." She had never asked his name or where he came from. When his wounds had healed enough for travel, she had simply handed him a leather pouch filled with dried meat and flatbread, and pointed toward the path that would take him home. But as he reached the edge of the clearing, she had called after him, "The stones remember, young wolf. When you've grown into your strength, remember that it was meant to protect, not to destroy." Now, standing in the shadow of the oak tree 23 years later, Ulfgrim could still feel the warmth of those stones against his skin and hear the wisdom in her words. The angry boy she had healed had indeed grown into his strength, becoming the most feared warrior in the northern lands. But somewhere in the process, he had forgotten the lesson she had tried to teach him about what that strength was truly for. The cottage door opened, and Halla stepped outside to gather wood for her fire. She moved slowly now, her back bent with age, and her once sure steps careful on the uneven ground. Her hair, white as fresh snow, was braided simply and adorned with small shells that caught the last light of the dying sun. She looked up as she bent to collect kindling, and for a moment, her eyes met his across the clearing. Recognition flickered in her gaze, not surprise, but acknowledgement, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her lower back, and raised the other in a greeting that was part blessing, part invitation, Ulfgrim felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking on the spring fjord. Without conscious thought, he stepped from behind the oak and walked across the clearing, his warrior's stride gentle to match the peace of this place. When he reached her, he knelt on one knee, bringing his massive frame down to her level, and spoke the first words he had said to her since that long-ago morning. "Mother Halla, do you remember a foolish boy who bled anger and pain into your healing hands?" Her smile was like sunrise after the longest winter night. "I remember a young wolf who needed to learn that his strength was a gift, not a burden." She reached out and touched his bearded cheek with fingers that still carried the scent of healing herbs. "And I see that the lesson took root, even if it took time to bloom." From that day forward, Ulfgrim had come to her cottage each dawn, bringing whatever she needed: firewood cut to size for her small hearth, fresh water from the spring that ran cold and clear year-round, meat from his own table when the hunting was good. They rarely spoke of the past, finding instead a comfortable rhythm in the simple tasks of daily life and the quiet wisdom that flows between souls who have found peace with each other. But tonight, as he prepared to leave her cottage and return to his duties, Ulfgrim carried with him a growing unease. The whispers Magnus had mentioned were not mere superstition. They were the first stirrings of something darker, a wind that would soon blow through Ironhold Valley and threaten everything he had come to cherish. The healing stones on Halla's table caught the firelight as he glanced back one last time, their ancient symbols seeming to pulse with urgent warning. Change was coming to their quiet sanctuary, and Ulfgrim feared that all his strength might not be enough to protect the gentle woman who had taught him the true meaning of courage. The morning that changed everything dawned grey and bitter, with ice crystals hanging in the air like broken glass. Ulfgrim woke before the first cockerel crowed, as was his habit, and dressed quietly in the darkness of his chamber. Outside, the world lay wrapped in that peculiar stillness that comes just before the sun breaks the horizon, when even the wind holds its breath. He had filled his wooden bowl with warm barley broth and was reaching for his cloak when the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the valley. Not the measured pace of a patrol or the urgent rhythm of a messenger, but the heavy drumming of many horses riding hard with purpose. Ulfgrim set down the bowl and moved to his window, peering through the morning gloom toward the main road that wound up from the southern passes. What he saw made his blood run cold. Thorvald Bloodaxe rode at the head of a column of 50 warriors, their armor black with travel and their weapons gleaming in the pale light. Behind them came wagons loaded with supplies and banners bearing the raven sigil of the High King. But it was the man himself who commanded attention. Thorvald sat his warhorse like a conqueror, his red hair and beard flowing from beneath a helm adorned with the horns of a bull. His reputation preceded him like the stench of burning villages, a warlord who had carved his way to power through a combination of cunning politics and ruthless violence. But it was what he carried that made Ulfgrim's stomach clench with dread. Hanging from Thorvald's saddle horn was an iron collar, black and heavy, forged with symbols that spoke of authority and oppression. It was the mark of the new order, the sign that the old ways were no longer tolerated in the lands under the High King's rule. Ulfgrim dressed quickly and made his way to the Great Hall, where Jarl Magnus was already receiving his unexpected guests. The hall buzzed with nervous energy as servants hurried to provide food and drink for the newcomers, while Magnus's own warriors stood at careful attention along the walls. The two groups eyed each other with the wary respect of wolves meeting on neutral ground. "Thorvald Bloodaxe," Magnus said, rising from his chair as Ulfgrim entered. "This is an unexpected honor. What brings the High King's champion to our humble valley?" Thorvald removed his helm and shook out his red mane, his pale blue eyes scanning the hall like a hunter evaluating prey. "I come bearing the High King's decree, Magnus Ironhold. The realm faces a new threat, one that strikes at the very heart of our people's strength." He gestured to one of his men, who unrolled a parchment and began to read in the formal tones reserved for royal proclamations. "By order of High King Eriksson the Unifier, all practice of the old magic arts is hereby forbidden throughout his realm. Those who consort with spirits, brew unnatural potions, or claim power over life and death through sorcery, shall be deemed enemies of the crown and dealt with accordingly. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, some nodding approval, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Ulfgrim felt his heart begin to pound, but he kept his expression carefully neutral as Thorvald continued. Too long have we allowed these remnants of the dark times to poison our people's minds. When a warrior falls in battle, it should be the gods who decide his fate, not some cackling crone with her herbs and incantations. When sickness comes to a household, it should be prayer and strength that carry them through, not dependence on witchcraft. Thorvald's voice rose with the fervor of a man convinced of his righteousness. The High King has seen how this weakness spreads. Villages that once produced fierce warriors now shelter behind the skirts of hedge witches and bone readers. It ends now here, in this valley, and every other settlement under our protection. Magnus stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. And what would you have us do, Thorvald? Root out every old woman who knows which herbs ease a fever? If necessary, yes. Thorvald's hand moved to rest on the iron collar at his belt. We start with the worst offenders. Those who practice the old rituals openly, who keep the forbidden symbols in their homes, who claim to speak with the spirits of the dead. They will be given a choice: renounce their dark arts publicly and submit to the crown's authority, or face the consequences of their defiance. The iron collar caught the firelight as he lifted it, and Ulfgrim saw how its surface was etched with runes of binding and submission. Anyone who wore such a thing would be marked forever as a former practitioner of forbidden arts, shamed before their community and stripped of any respect they might once have commanded. I'm told you have such a one in this very valley, Thorvald said, his gaze moving to survey the faces around him. An old healer who lives apart from the village proper, who keeps the ancient stones and speaks the old words. The people whisper that she can cure wounds that should have killed a man, that she knows secrets that died with the heathen priests. Ulfgrim's blood turned to ice water in his veins. There could be no doubt who Thorvald meant, and the casual way he spoke of Halla made it clear that her fate was already decided in his mind. The wooden bowl sitting in his chamber seemed to burn in his memory, a symbol of the gentle mercy that had no place in Thorvald's new order. We'll investigate these claims thoroughly, Magnus said carefully. If such practices exist in our valley, they will be dealt with according to the High King's wishes. Good. Thorvald smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I knew we could count on the loyalty of Ironhold. In 3 days' time, I will hold a public ceremony in your village square. Any who practice the forbidden arts will be given the opportunity to confess their crimes and accept the crown's mercy. Those who refuse, he let the threat hang unfinished in the air. As the formal reception continued, Ulfgrim found himself studying the faces of Thorvald's warriors. These were hard men, veterans of the border wars who had learned to see the world in stark terms of loyalty and betrayal. Their eyes held the cold certainty of those who had been taught that mercy was weakness and that the old ways were chains that bound their people to a shameful past. When the gathering finally dispersed, Ulfgrim made his way through the village with measured steps, nodding to the familiar faces he passed while his mind raced with implications. Already he could see the change beginning to take hold. Conversation stopped when he approached, and eyes that had once met his with frank respect now held questions and uncertainty. At the blacksmith's forge, he paused to watch old Gunnar working iron into horseshoe nails. The smith's wife had died the previous winter, despite, or perhaps because of, the ministrations of the village's new Christian priest. Gunnar had spoken openly of his regret that he hadn't sought out the old healer who lived at the valley's edge, the one who might have known which herbs could have broken his wife's fever. Gunnar, Ulfgrim said quietly. A word. The smith set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his brow. Aye, lord. What can I do for you? The talk you've heard about old women and healing, forget it. Whatever you've said, whatever you've thought, put it from your mind. The days for such things have passed. Gunnar's weathered face showed confusion, then dawning understanding as the implications settled in. "The old woman at the valley's edge, is she in danger?" Ulfgrim met his eyes steadily. "Anyone who draws Thorvald's attention is in danger. Speak no more of healers or herbs or ancient knowledge. If your neighbors ask, tell them you know nothing of such things." As the sun reached its peak, Ulfgrim finally made his way to the familiar path that led to Halla's cottage. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge of what was coming and the terrible choice that lay before him. In 3 days, Thorvald would demand that she renounce everything she was, everything she represented, or face whatever punishment his justice demanded. The cottage came into view through the trees, peaceful and unchanged, with smoke rising from its chimney and herbs still hanging from the eaves. But now those herbs looked different to Ulfgrim's eyes, not symbols of healing wisdom, but evidence of forbidden practices that could cost an old woman her life. He found Halla in her garden, tending to the plants that would soon be among the last of their kind in the valley. She looked up as he approached, and he saw in her eyes that she already understood what he had come to tell her. "The new order has arrived," she said simply, brushing dirt from her hands. "I, Thorvald Bloodaxe, the High King's champion. He speaks of ceremonies and confessions, of iron collars and submission." Ulfgrim's voice was heavy with the weight of inevitability. "Mother Halla, you must leave. Tonight, under cover of darkness. I can provide horses, supplies, a guide to take you north, where Thorvald's reach doesn't extend." But she was already shaking her head, a sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "My roots go too deep, young wolf. This cottage, this garden, these stones, they are all that remains of something precious. If I flee, that knowledge dies with me. If you stay, you die regardless," Ulfgrim said urgently. "Thorvald will not be turned aside by age or innocence. He sees the old ways as poison that must be burned out completely." Halla reached out and touched his arm with hands that still carried the scent of healing herbs. "Perhaps it is time for an old woman to make her choice about what matters most. The healing stones have been in my family for 9 generations. Should I be the one to let them scatter to the wind?" That evening, as darkness settled over the valley like a shroud, Ulfgrim sat alone in his chamber and stared at the wooden bowl that had carried so many morning meals to a cottage at the world's edge. In 3 days, everything would change, and he would be forced to choose between the loyalty that had defined his life and the mercy that had saved his soul. Outside his window, he could see torches burning in Thorvald's camp, bright points of light that spoke of a new order built on the ashes of the old. The iron collar would find its way around someone's neck before the week was done. The only question was whether Ulfgrim would be the one to place it there. The second day brought with it a tension that hung over Ironhold Valley like the smoke from a distant fire. Ulfgrim woke to find frost covering his window in patterns that reminded him of the runes carved into Halla's healing stones. Delicate, ancient and fragile enough to be destroyed by the first harsh breath of change. He had not slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thorvald's iron collar gleaming in the firelight, heard again the casual certainty in the warlord's voice when he spoke of rooting out the old ways. Worse still, he remembered the faces of the warriors who had listened, men who had once fought beside him, who respected his judgment, but who now looked at him with questions they dared not voice. The morning routine that had once brought him peace now felt like a betrayal. As he filled the wooden bowl with warm broth, his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowledge that each trip to Halla's cottage brought them both closer to discovery. Yet the thought of leaving her to face these final days alone was unbearable. When he stepped outside, the village was already stirring with unusual activity. Thorvald's men moved through the streets in small groups, their eyes cataloguing every detail with the thoroughness of occupying soldiers. They paused to examine herb gardens, questioned villagers about their neighbors' habits, and made careful notes in leather-bound books that would become evidence when the time for judgment arrived. Ulfgrim caught sight of Bjorn the Younger, one of his most trusted warriors, deep in conversation with 2 of Thorvald's scouts near the market square. The sight filled him with unease, not because he doubted Bjorn's loyalty, but because he could see how easily good men could be turned into instruments of oppression when they believed they served a righteous cause. "Lord Ulfgrim," called a voice from behind him. He turned to see Eric Ravenhair, Magnus's nephew, and one of the promising young warriors in their ranks. The boy, for at 19, he was still a boy despite his size and skill, approached with the eager energy of youth, but something troubled in his expression. "Eric, you're up early." "I couldn't sleep, Lord. There's talk among the men, questions about what we're meant to do when Thorvald holds his ceremony." Eric glanced around nervously before continuing. "Some say we should help him root out any witch folk in our valley. Others wonder if we're meant to protect our own people from outsiders, regardless of what they practice." The question hung between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Ulfgrim studied the young man's face and saw reflected there the same conflict that gnawed at his own heart. Eric had been raised on stories of honor and loyalty, taught that a warrior's duty was to protect his people and serve his lord without question. But what happened when those duties pulled in opposite directions? "What do you think, Eric? Where does our first loyalty lie?" The young warrior straightened, as if the question were a test he had been preparing for all his life. "With our people, Lord. With Ironhold Valley and those who call it home." But his voice faltered as the implications of that answer became clear. "But some of our people practice the old ways," Ulfgrim finished gently. "Some keep healing herbs and remember the songs their grandmothers taught them. Some still call upon spirits older than the Christ God when their children fall sick." Eric nodded miserably. "My own grandmother taught me to read the flight of ravens. She said it was no different from reading the weather in the clouds or the mood of the sea in its color. But Thorvald's men would call that witchcraft. Here was the heart of the poison that Thorvald had brought to their valley. Not just the threat to individuals like Halla, but the way suspicion spread like rot through a community, turning neighbor against neighbor and making criminals of gentle wisdom that had served their people for generations. "Keep your own counsel, Eric," Ulfgrim said finally. "Speak little and listen much. When the time comes for choosing, trust your heart to guide you toward honor." As the day progressed, Ulfgrim found himself caught between his public duties and his private anguish. He attended the War Council, where Thorvald outlined his plans for the upcoming ceremony, nodding appropriately while his stomach churned with each detail. The warlord had arranged for a platform to be built in the village square, where those accused of practicing forbidden arts would be called forward to confess their crimes and accept the crown's mercy or face immediate punishment. "Your valley has been blessed with peace for too long," Thorvald declared, his pale eyes sweeping the assembled warriors. "Peace breeds complacency, and complacency allows corruption to take root. Better to cut out the infected flesh now before it poisons the whole body." Magnus asked careful questions about procedure and authority, while Ulfgrim sat silent and counted the cost of each answer. How many of his neighbors would be dragged before that platform? How many would choose the shame of the iron collar over whatever alternative Thorvald offered? And what would happen to those who, like Halla, refused both options? After the council dispersed, Ulfgrim made his way through the village once more, but this time he carried with him a small leather pouch containing dried fish and journey bread. To any casual observer, he might have been preparing for a hunt or a patrol. In truth, he was gathering supplies for the escape he still hoped to convince Halla to accept. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the pines when he reached her cottage, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber that made the humble dwelling look almost magical. Halla was sitting outside her door, her healing stones arranged on a wooden board before her as she worked to polish their surfaces with a soft cloth. Each stone seemed to glow within a light as she cleaned away years of accumulated dust and handling. "They're beautiful," Ulfgrim said, settling himself on the ground beside her with careful grace. "My grandmother's grandmother carved these runes," Halla replied, holding up a stone marked with symbols that predated any written language he knew. "Each one holds a memory, not just of healing, but of the women who carried this knowledge before me. When I touch them, I can almost hear their voices whispering guidance. She set the stone aside and picked up another, this one smaller and darker, carved with interlocking spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward. This one was with me the night I found you bleeding in the forest. It sang to me of wounds that needed more than flesh mending, of a heart that carried pain deeper than any bear's claws could reach. Ulfgrim accepted the stone when she placed it in his palm, feeling its weight and warmth. For a moment, he could almost believe he heard something, a whisper of ancient wisdom, an echo of the compassion that had saved his life all those years ago. "Mother Halla," he said carefully, "I've brought supplies. Enough for a journey north, where the mountain passes led to valleys Thorvald has never seen. You could carry your stones with you, find a new place to tend your garden." She smiled and shook her head, the same gentle refusal she had given him yesterday. "And leave my neighbors to face tomorrow's ceremony without anyone to speak for the old ways. Leave the young mothers to wonder what herbs might have saved their children, or the old men to forget the songs that ease their passage to the afterlife. Better to live in exile than die for principles," Ulfgrim said, though even as he spoke the words he knew they rang hollow. "Would they?" Halla asked quietly. "You've spent your life fighting for this valley, young wolf. Would you choose exile over death if someone threatened what you hold sacred?" The question struck him like a physical blow, because he knew the answer. He had built his reputation on the very principles she spoke of, the willingness to die rather than abandon those who depended on him. How could he ask her to do what he himself would never consider? As the shadows lengthened and evening approached, they sat together in companionable silence. The healing stones spread between them like fragments of a disappearing world. Tomorrow would bring the final day before Thorvald's ceremony, and Ulfgrim knew the time was running out for all of them. The third dawn arrived grey and cold, carrying with it the weight of finality. Today, Thorvald would hold his ceremony, and by sunset the old ways would either be broken or defended. Ulfgrim dressed in darkness, his movements automatic while his mind churned with possibilities that led nowhere good. He had barely stepped outside when he encountered Magnus, waiting by the great hall's entrance, the Jarl's weathered face grave in the pre-dawn gloom. "Walk with me, old friend," Magnus said, and there was something in his tone that made Ulfgrim's chest tighten with apprehension. They moved in silence through the sleeping village until they reached the ancient stone circle that crowned the hill above the settlement. Here, generations of their ancestors had gathered to make decisions that shaped the valley's fate. The standing stones, worn smooth by wind and weather, seemed to whisper of older loyalties that ran deeper than any king's decree. "Thorvald came to me last night," Magnus said finally, his breath misting in the cold air. "He has specific information about the old woman, her name, her location, even details about the healing stones she keeps. Someone has been talking." The words hit Ulfgrim like a physical blow. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it still stole his breath. "Who?" He wouldn't say, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is what he expects from us, from you specifically. Magnus turned to face him directly. "He wants you to bring her in, Ulfgrim. You're to go to her cottage this morning, place her under arrest, and deliver her to the ceremony. He says it will send the proper message about loyalty and duty." Ulfgrim felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Of all the scenarios he had imagined, he had never considered that he might be the instrument of Halla's destruction. "And if I refuse? Then Thorvald will question your loyalty to the crown, and mine as well, for harboring a defiant subordinate. He has 50 warriors at his back, Ulfgrim, good men who believe they serve righteousness. If it comes to open conflict, the valley bleeds either way," Ulfgrim finished, understanding the trap that had been laid. "Thorvald gets his demonstration of power, whether I obey or rebel." Magnus nodded grimly. "There's more. He's given me a token to pass along, something to remind you where your true allegiance should lie." The Jarl reached into his cloak and withdrew an object that made Ulfgrim's blood run cold. It was a leather cord strung with iron rings, the very rings from his own beard, the ones that marked his victories and defined his identity as a warrior. But these had been twisted and blackened, transformed from symbols of honor into reminders of chains that bound him to Thorvald's will. "He took these from your chamber while you slept," Magnus said quietly. "His message is clear. He owns you now, as he owns all of us. The question is whether you'll serve willingly or be dragged into compliance." Ulfgrim stared at the corrupted rings, feeling something fundamental break inside his chest. The violation of his private space, the casual theft of his most personal possessions, the message that no sanctuary existed beyond Thorvald's reach. It was a masterwork of intimidation designed to strip away every illusion of choice or freedom. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Known what?" "About my visits to Halla, about the mornings I've spent carrying broth to an old woman who should have died forgotten and alone." Magnus was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon, where the first pale light was beginning to show. "I've known since the second week. Did you think the movements of my champion would go unnoticed? But I also knew why you went and what it meant to you. Some loyalties run deeper than duty, Ulfgrim. Some debts can't be paid with gold or service. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm." All this time Magnus had known and said nothing, allowing his greatest warrior the private mercy that had sustained him through years of violence and conquest. Now that silence had become complicity in whatever choice Ulfgrim made next. "What would you do?" Ulfgrim asked. "If you were me, what choice would honor demand?" "I'm not you," Magnus replied. "I never bled out my rage and fury in an old woman's healing hands. I never learned that strength could be gentle, or that mercy could be fierce. Those lessons were yours alone, and so is the choice of what to do with them." As the sun climbed higher, they made their way back to the village, where the platform for Thorvald's ceremony was already taking shape. Rough-hewn planks had been lashed together to create a stage that would elevate the proceedings above the gathered crowd. Iron posts stood ready to hold banners, and a wooden chair waited for the man who would sit in judgment. The activity reminded Ulfgrim of preparations for an execution, and perhaps that was exactly what it was, the killing of something precious that could never be resurrected once it was gone. He watched the villagers gathering in small groups, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and dread that comes when ordinary people are forced to witness the exercise of absolute power. Near the platform, he spotted Eric Ravenhair speaking urgently with several other young warriors. The boy's face was tight with anxiety, and Ulfgrim could see the same conflict playing out in a dozen other conversations around the square. Good people trying to understand how their world had changed overnight, struggling to find their footing on ground that no longer felt solid beneath their feet. "Lord Ulfgrim," called a voice from behind him. He turned to see Bjorn the Younger approaching with purposeful strides, his expression carefully neutral. "Thorvald wishes to speak with you before the ceremony begins." The summons felt like a death knell, but Ulfgrim nodded and followed Bjorn toward the great hall, where Thorvald had established his temporary court. Each step brought him closer to the moment when he would have to choose between the loyalty that had defined his life and the mercy that had saved his soul. Inside the hall, Thorvald waited with the iron collar hanging from his belt and a smile that held no warmth. Around him stood his most trusted warriors, men whose eyes reflected the absolute certainty of those who had never questioned their orders or wondered about the cost of obedience. "Ulfgrim Ironjaw," Thorvald said, rising from Magnus's chair with theatrical precision. "The time has come to prove your loyalty to the crown and demonstrate the strength of your commitment to the new order. You know what I require of you." Ulfgrim met his gaze steadily, though inside he felt as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice with wolves behind him and empty air ahead. "I know. Good, bring me the witch woman before the sun reaches its peak. Let your people see that even their greatest champion serves the will of the High King above all other considerations." The dismissal was clear, but as Ulfgrim turned to leave, Thorvald's voice followed him like a blade, between the shoulder blades. Oh, and Ulfgrim, should you be tempted to let misplaced sentiment cloud your judgment, remember that mercy shown to enemies of the crown is itself an act of treason. The iron collar awaits all who choose the wrong side in this matter. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher toward its merciless peak, and Ulfgrim knew that within hours everything he had ever believed about honor and duty would be tested in the crucible of an impossible choice. The sun stood a quarter of the way to its peak when Ulfgrim finally took the familiar path toward Halla's cottage, his feet moving with the weight of condemned man, walking to his execution. In his hands he carried not the wooden bowl that had become their morning ritual, but iron shackles provided by Thorvald's men, cold metal that seemed to burn his palms with each step. Behind him, concealed in the forest shadows, he knew Bjorn the Younger followed with a small group of warriors. Thorvald trusted nothing to chance, especially not the loyalty of a man whose reputation had been built on independent thinking and personal honor. If Ulfgrim faltered in his duty, if sentiment overwhelmed obedience, those hidden watchers would ensure the old woman reached the ceremony platform regardless. The cottage appeared through the trees exactly as it always had, peaceful, humble, wreathed in morning mist that made it seem like something from a half-remembered dream. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin grey line, and the herbs hanging from the eaves stirred gently in the breeze. But today, those familiar sights felt like accusations, reminders of the sanctuary he was about to violate. Halla was waiting for him in her garden. Kneeling among the plants she had tended for decades, with the same care a mother gives to her children. She wore her finest dress, grey wool adorned with silver threads that caught the sunlight, and her white hair was braided with small blue flowers that grew wild near the stream. She had prepared for this moment as if it were a festival rather than a judgment. "You came," she said, without looking up from her work, her voice carrying neither surprise nor reproach. "I had no choice." The words felt like ash in his mouth. "Thorvald has given me orders. You're to come with me to the village square, to face his ceremony." "I know." She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands with the same calm precision she had always shown. "I've been ready since before dawn, but there's something I must show you first, something that cannot wait for ceremony or judgment." She led him to the cottage door, where she paused and pressed her hand against the wooden frame. "This house has sheltered 12 generations of healing women, young wolf. Each one faced moments when the world demanded they choose between survival and principle. Some chose to hide their gifts, to practice their craft in shadows and whispers. Others chose to stand openly and accept whatever consequences followed. Inside the cottage, everything had been arranged with deliberate care. The healing stones sat in perfect order on the wooden table, each one positioned according to patterns that spoke of ancient knowledge and sacred purpose. Beside them lay a scroll of parchment, written in Halla's careful script, a record of every healing remedy, every bit of wisdom she had learned from her predecessors. "This is my grandmother's legacy," she said, touching the scroll with reverence. "And her grandmother's before that? The knowledge of which plants ease fever, which songs comfort the dying, which stones draw poison from infected wounds. If I am to face Thorvald's judgment, someone must carry this wisdom forward." She picked up one of the healing stones, the same dark one marked with spirals that she had placed in his palm 2 days before. But now he saw that it was different from the others, newer somehow, though carved with symbols just as ancient. "I made this one for you," she said quietly. "The night after I found you bleeding in the forest, I sat by my fire and carved your story into the stone. Not the tale of battles won and enemies conquered, but the deeper truth, how anger became wisdom, how rage transformed into mercy." Ulfgrim accepted the stone with hands that trembled, despite his efforts to remain composed. The surface was warm to the touch, and the spirals seemed to pulse with inner light that spoke of transformations deeper than any physical healing. "Mother Halla, you don't understand what Thorvald will do. The iron collar is only the beginning. If you resist, if you refuse to renounce your practices, he will kill me," she finished calmly. Yes, I understand that quite clearly. But you don't understand what he will do to you if you bring me to him in chains. The boy I healed would die a second death, and the man you've become would be lost forever. The truth of her words hit him like a warhammer to the chest. In all his agonizing over the choice between duty and mercy, he had never considered the deeper cost, not just to his conscience, but to his very soul. The iron shackles in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if they were forged not from metal, but from the weight of all his future regrets. "There is another way," Halla continued, moving to gather her precious stones into a leather pouch. "But it requires more courage than either obedience or defiance. It requires you to trust in the wisdom that brought you to my door all those years ago." Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside the cottage. Bjorn's voice called out with forced casualness, "Lord Ulfgrim, the ceremony will begin soon." Thorvald grows impatient. The moment of decision had arrived, crystallizing into a single instant that would define everything that followed. Ulfgrim looked at the iron shackles in his hands, then at Halla's face, serene, determined, utterly without fear. In her eyes, he saw reflected not the angry boy who had bled out his rage in her healing hands, but the man he had chosen to become through decades of small acts of mercy and quiet courage. "Tell Thorvald the witch woman is coming," he called back to Bjorn. "But she comes of her own will, not as a prisoner." Halla's smile was like sunrise after the longest winter night. "Now you begin to understand, young wolf. The greatest strength is knowing when not to use it." She gathered her healing stones and the scroll that contained her life's work, wrapping them carefully in a cloth that had been blessed by 9 generations of wise women. As they prepared to leave the cottage together, Ulfgrim felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, not the breaking of loyalty, but its transformation into something deeper and more true. The path back to the village had never seemed so long or so short, each step carrying them toward a confrontation that would test not just their courage, but their understanding of what honor truly meant. Behind them, the cottage stood empty for the first time in memory, its windows dark and its hearth cold, a symbol of knowledge passing from one keeper to the next. In his pocket, the healing stone Halla had made for him seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him that some gifts can only be received by those willing to carry them forward, regardless of the cost. Today, in front of the entire village, he would discover whether he had the strength to be worthy of that trust. The village square buzzed with tension as thick as smoke from a green fire. Word had spread that the ceremony would begin at midday, and already the platform stood crowded with Thorvald's warriors, while villagers gathered in uneasy clusters around the edges of the square. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, sensing the adult fear without understanding its source. While old men muttered prayers to gods both new and ancient, Ulfgrim and Halla approached from the forest path, moving with the measured dignity of those who had made peace with their choices. She walked beside him rather than before him, her head held high and her precious bundle of healing stones clutched against her chest. To any observer, they might have been grandmother and grandson, sharing a quiet morning stroll until the crowd noticed the iron shackles hanging. Unused from Ulfgrim's belt, Thorvald stood at the center of the platform like a conqueror surveying his domain, his red hair and beard brilliant in the noon sun. The iron collar gleamed at his waist, and his pale eyes swept the gathering crowd with the satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully driven his prey into an inescapable trap. When he spotted Ulfgrim and Halla emerging from the forest, his smile grew sharp as a blade's edge. "Behold!" Thorvald's voice carried easily across the square, trained by years of addressing warriors on battlefields. "The great Ulfgrim Ironjaw brings us the witch woman, as befits a loyal servant of the crown. Let all who witness this moment understand that no one, not the mightiest warrior nor the humblest healer, stands above the High King's law." A murmur ran through the crowd, part approval and part unease. Ulfgrim could see faces he had known for years, Gunnar the smith, whose wife had died despite the priest's prayers, Eric Raven-Hair, standing tense among the younger warriors, Magnus, watching from the steps of the great hall with carefully controlled expression, all of them waiting to see what manner of man their champion would prove to be when the moment of testing arrived. As they climbed the wooden steps to the platform, Halla paused and turned to address the assembled villagers. Her voice, though aged, carried clearly in the still air, reaching every corner of the square with words that had been chosen with the precision of a master craftsman. "My friends and neighbors," she began, and somehow that simple phrase transformed the crowd from spectators into participants. "I have lived among you for more years than many of you have drawn breath. I have eased your children's fevers, tended your wounds when the harvest brought injuries, and sat with your elders as they passed from this world to whatever lies beyond." Thorvald's expression darkened at this interruption of his carefully planned ceremony. But something in the crowd's reaction, a stirring of recognition, a softening of hostile faces, kept him from silencing her immediately. This was not the cowering confession he had expected, but something far more dangerous, the voice of living memory, speaking truth to power. "I do not deny that I practice the old ways," Halla continued, her hand moving to rest on the bundle of healing stones. "These belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before that, passed down through generations, of women who understood that healing is sacred work that serves the divine regardless of which name we use to call upon it." She lifted one of the stones, not the personal one she had carved for Ulfgrim, but an ancient piece marked with symbols so old their meaning had been forgotten even by her. In the sunlight it seemed to glow with inner fire, drawing the eye and holding it with the magnetism of something touched by forces beyond ordinary understanding. This stone was carved by the first healer to settle in this valley more than 200 years ago. She used it to draw fever from the children of your ancestors, to ease the passing of warriors too proud to show their pain, to call back souls that had wandered too far from their bodies in times of great trauma. The crowd pressed closer. Despite the presence of Thorvald's armed warriors, Ulfgrim could see the hunger in their faces, not for spectacle, but for connection to something larger than themselves, some acknowledgement that their lives held meaning beyond mere survival and conquest. Thorvald stepped forward, his hand moving to rest on the pommel of his sword. "Enough of this heretical rambling. The time for confession has come, old woman. Renounce your dark practices, accept the collar of repentance, and submit to the crown's mercy." Halla turned to face him directly, and in that moment, Ulfgrim saw something that took his breath away. She was no longer the frail healer he had protected and cherished, but something far more powerful, a keeper of flame who had chosen to let her light burn bright, even if it consumed her in the process. "I cannot renounce what has brought only healing and comfort to those in need," she said quietly. "I cannot call evil what has served the cause of mercy for more generations than your crown has existed. If that makes me your enemy, then I accept that burden, but I will not dishonor the women who came before me by betraying their trust." The ancient healing stone in her hand seemed to pulse with light, and for a moment the entire square held its breath. Then Thorvald's patience snapped like an overdrawn bowstring. "Seize her," he commanded his warriors. "If she will not accept mercy, then let her face justice." But as the armed men moved forward, Ulfgrim stepped between them and Halla, his massive frame blocking their path. The iron shackles fell from his hands to clatter on the wooden platform, the sound echoing across the suddenly silent square like a declaration of war. "No," he said, and the word carried all the authority of a man who had never retreated from any battlefield. "She came here freely, and she will leave the same way, or not at all." Thorvald's face flushed red with fury. "Stand aside, Ulfgrim. Your duty is to the crown, not to this practitioner of forbidden arts." "My duty," Ulfgrim replied, his hand moving to rest on the healing stone Halla had given him, "is to protect what is sacred from those who would destroy it in the name of power." The confrontation crystallized into a tableau that would be remembered long after the last participant had passed. into legend, the young warlord drunk on authority facing the seasoned warrior, who had found something worth dying for, with an old woman's wisdom standing between them like a bridge across an unbridgeable chasm. In the crowd below, Eric Ravenhair placed his hand on his sword hilt, and Gunnar the Smith stepped forward from the press of bodies. Other faces showed the same stirring of decision, the same recognition that this moment would define not just Halla's fate, but the soul of their entire community. The ancient healing stone caught the sun one final time, its light seeming to ask a question that each person present would have to answer for themselves. What price are you willing to pay for what you believe? The silence stretched across the square like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, every eye fixed on the confrontation unfolding on the wooden platform. Thorvald's hand tightened on his sword hilt, his pale blue eyes measuring the distance between himself and the giant warrior who had dared to defy him. Around them his loyal men shifted nervously, caught between their orders and their respect for Ulfgrim's legendary prowess. But it was Magnus who broke the tension, his voice cutting through the stillness with the authority of long command. "Hold, all of you." The Jarl stepped forward from the great hall's entrance, moving with the careful dignity of a man who understood that his next words would either prevent bloodshed or unleash it upon his people. "There is something you should know, Thorvald Bloodaxe, before you proceed with this ceremony." Magnus reached into his cloak and withdrew an object that made the crowd gasp, a silver pendant bearing the seal of the High King himself, but not the current ruler. This seal was older, its surface worn smooth by generations of handling, and marked with symbols that predated the new order by decades. This belonged to High King Ericsson's father, Magnus said, holding the pendant where all could see it. "And it carries with it a decree that has never been rescinded, though many have chosen to forget its existence." Thorvald's confident expression faltered slightly. "What are you talking about, old man? Show me this decree." From another fold of his cloak, Magnus produced a scroll bound with cord that had once been white, but had yellowed with age. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it, revealing text written in the formal script of royal scribes and sealed with wax that bore the unmistakable mark of absolute authority. "By order of High King Olafsson the Wise," Magnus read, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "let it be known that those who practice the healing arts, according to the ancient traditions of our people, shall be protected under the crown's authority, provided their work serves to preserve life and ease suffering. No lord or jarl shall persecute such practitioners, nor shall any warrior raise his hand against those who carry the sacred knowledge of healing." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Thorvald's face went white, then flushed red with fury as the implications became clear. "That decree is from the old king, dead these past 5 years. His son's authority supersedes any proclamation." "Does it?" Magnus interrupted, his weathered face showing the ghost of a smile. "The current High King has issued many edicts, but none that specifically revoke his father's protection of healers. Indeed, the royal seal on this document carries a curious inscription, one that declares the protection to remain in force until formally challenged and overturned by a gathering of all the realm's jarls." Halla stepped forward, her ancient healing stone still glowing in her grasp. "There's more, isn't there, Magnus Ironhold? Something you discovered when you sent riders south to verify Thorvald's authority." The Jarl nodded slowly. "My messengers returned last night with disturbing news. The High King issued no orders regarding the persecution of healers. In fact, his most recent decrees have focused entirely on securing the southern borders against Saxon raids. The campaign against the old ways, it seems to be Thorvald's personal interpretation of his mandate." The platform erupted in chaos as Thorvald's warriors exchanged uncertain glances, and the crowd below pressed forward, hungry for answers. But it was Bjorn the Younger who voiced the question burning in every mind. "Are you saying Thorvald has been acting without royal authority?" "I'm saying," Magnus replied carefully, "that a wise ruler learns the difference between interpreting orders and inventing them. and the loyal subject ensures that his actions truly serve his king's will, not his own ambitions. Thorvald's hand moved to his sword, but before he could draw it, another voice rang out from the edge of the square, young, clear, and filled with the kind of moral certainty that only comes to those who have witnessed injustice firsthand. "There's something else you should know about Thorvald Bloodaxe," Eric Ravenhair called out, stepping forward from the crowd with his own hand resting on his weapon. "Something I learned last night when I couldn't sleep and went walking in the forest." All eyes turned to the young warrior as he climbed the steps to the platform, his face pale but determined. In his hands he carried a leather satchel that he held out for all to see. "I found this hidden in Thorvald's camp," Eric said, opening the satchel to reveal its contents. "Gold coins bearing the mark of the Southern Lords, the same lords who lost their coastal settlements to our raids last summer. The same lords who would benefit greatly if Ironhold Valley fell into chaos and could no longer threaten their trade routes." The revelation struck the assembly like a physical blow. Thorvald had not come to purify their valley of forbidden practices. He had come to destroy it from within, using their own loyalty and religious fear as weapons against them. The iron collar at his belt suddenly looked different, not a symbol of royal justice, but a tool of conquest disguised as righteousness. "You lie," Thorvald snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "That gold came from Lord Aelred of the southern coast," Eric continued relentlessly. "The same lord whose son you killed in single combat 6 months ago during the negotiations for tribute. The same lord who swore vengeance against any who had wronged his family." Halla's ancient healing stone pulsed with light, and suddenly Ulfgrim understood why it seemed so familiar. He had seen stones like it before, during his raids on the southern settlements, not in the hands of witches and healers, but adorning the temples, where the Christian priests preached about the evils of the old ways. "The southern lords fear our unity," Halla said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the square despite its gentleness. "They know that as long as our people remember the ancient bonds that tie us together, warrior to healer, protector to protected, we remain strong enough to resist their influence. But if they could turn us against each other, make us see enemies where we once saw friends, then we would destroy ourselves," Magnus finished grimly, "and leave our valley defenseless against their ambitions." The truth of it crashed over the assembly like a wave against stone. Thorvald had not come as the High King's champion, but as a weapon forged by their enemies and aimed at the heart of their community. The iron collar, the ceremony, the demands for confession and submission, all of it designed to shatter the bonds that made them strong. But as understanding dawned, so did rage. The warriors who had followed Thorvald began to back away from him, their hands moving to their weapons as they realized how they had been deceived. The villagers pressed closer to the platform, their faces showing the transition from fear to fury as they grasped the magnitude of the betrayal. "You have no proof," Thorvald said desperately. But his protests rang hollow in the face of the evidence arrayed against him. "These are lies, fabrications designed to what?" Ulfgrim interrupted, stepping closer to the man who had tried to turn him into an instrument of destruction. "To prevent you from completing your mission, to save an old woman's life and our valley's soul." The healing stone in Halla's hands blazed with sudden brilliance, as if all the accumulated wisdom of generations had focused into a single point of radiant truth. And in that light, Thorvald's true nature was finally revealed, not a servant of justice, but a mercenary who had sold his honor to the highest bidder. "The question now," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, "is what we do with a man who would poison a community's heart for foreign gold." Around the platform, 50 of Thorvald's warriors found themselves surrounded by an entire village that had awakened to the threat in their midst. But the real battle was only beginning, because Thorvald Bloodaxe had not come this far to be thwarted by the revelation of his true purpose. His hand closed around the iron collar at his belt, and his pale eyes fixed on Halla with the desperate fury of a cornered predator. If he could not complete his mission through deception, then perhaps he could still achieve it through violence and take the old woman's life as a final act of spite against those who had dared to expose him. The moment of truth crystallized like frost forming on a blade's edge. Thorvald's hand tightened around the iron collar, his knuckles white with the force of his grip, while the crowd below surged with the restless energy of people who had discovered they had been betrayed. But even as the truth of his deception spread through the square like wildfire, the false champion retained one crucial advantage. He still commanded 50 seasoned warriors who, regardless of their growing doubts, remained bound by oaths of service that could not be easily broken. "Stand with me," Thorvald called to his men, his voice carrying the desperate authority of a commander whose position had become untenable, but who refused to surrender without a fight. "These people have been corrupted by witchcraft, poisoned against the crown's authority by the very evil we came to root out. The gold means nothing. Any enemy would pay to see the High King's will thwarted." Several of his warriors shifted uneasily, their loyalty warring with the evidence of their leader's treachery. These were good men who had followed orders they believed came from their rightful king, and the revelation that they had been deceived cut them to the bone. But military discipline ran deep, and the habits of obedience were not easily broken, even when the commander's honor lay in ruins. Ulfgrim watched the dangerous dynamics playing out around him with a tactical awareness that had kept him alive through countless battles. Thorvald's men were wavering, but they remained armed and trained. The villagers had numbers and righteousness on their side, but most carried only farming tools and hunting knives. If violence erupted here, the platform would become a slaughter ground that would stain the valley with innocent blood. "There's another way," he said, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a sword through silk. "A way that honors both justice and mercy, that serves truth without drowning it in needless death." All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, placing himself between Thorvald and Halla while addressing the assembled crowd with the same authority he had once used to rally warriors before battle. "Thorvald Bloodaxe stands accused of deception, of serving foreign masters while claiming to represent our king. These are grave charges that require proper judgment, not the passion of an angry mob." He gestured toward Magnus, who nodded slowly as he understood where this was leading. "Let the matter be decided according to the old laws," Ulfgrim continued. "Let Thorvald face trial by combat, where the gods themselves can judge between truth and falsehood. If his cause is just, let him prove it with his sword. If he has betrayed his oath and deceived his followers, let that betrayal be revealed in single combat." The proposal sent a ripple of approval through the crowd. Trial by combat was an ancient tradition that even the Christian priests could not entirely suppress, rooted in the belief that divine justice would guide the outcome of a properly conducted duel. It offered a path between chaos and injustice, a way to resolve the crisis without turning the village square into a battlefield. But Thorvald's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been relief. "You would challenge me, Ironjaw? The great champion of Ironhold Valley, offering to settle this matter with steel instead of words." "I would," Ulfgrim replied simply. "But not as your enemy, Thorvald. As the defender of this valley's honor, and of an old woman who has harmed no one with her healing." Thorvald laughed, a sound devoid of humor, but rich with confidence. "Then you have made the last mistake of your legendary career. I've killed 37 men in single combat, Ulfgrim. Warriors from every corner of the northern lands, each one convinced that his cause was righteous and his skill unmatched. Their bones lie scattered from the ice-locked fjords to the green hills of the south." He drew his sword with a flourish, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. It was a magnificent weapon, its steel folded a dozen times and etched with runes that spoke of victories in battles fought from the frozen wastes to the warm southern seas. The crossguard was wrought in the shape of a raven's wings, and the pommel bore a blood-red ruby that caught the afternoon sun like a drop of fresh gore. "This blade has never known defeat," Thorvald continued, making a series of practice cuts that whistled through the air with lethal precision. It was forged by the dwarf smiths of the eastern mountains and blessed by priests whose names are written in the Chronicles of 3 kingdoms. Against it, what can you offer? Raw strength and the favor of an old witch. Ulfgrim reached to his belt and drew his own weapon, not the magnificent war axe that had made him famous across the northern lands, but a simple iron blade barely 3 feet long. The sword was old and plain, its surface marked with the nicks and stains of long use, its leather grip worn smooth by countless hours of practice and battle. To any observer, it seemed pitiful compared to Thorvald's splendid weapon. But Halla stepped forward and pressed something into Ulfgrim's free hand, the healing stone she had carved with his story, warm with the accumulated wisdom of generations. "This blade served your grandfather and his grandfather before him," she said quietly. "It was forged not for glory or conquest, but for protection. It has never been used except in defense of those who could not defend themselves." As her words carried across the square, something shifted in the atmosphere. The villagers pressed closer, drawn by the recognition that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple duel. This was a battle between 2 ways of seeing the world, one that valued strength for its own sake, and another that understood strength as a tool in service of something greater. Magnus stepped forward to formalize the combat according to ancient tradition. "Let it be known that these warriors meet in fair combat to settle a matter of honor and truth. The victory belongs to whomever the gods favor, and the judgment rendered here will be accepted by all present." He gestured toward the edges of the platform, where Thorvald's men had drawn back to form a rough circle. Eric Ravenhair stood among them, his young face grim with the understanding that he might soon witness the death of the man who had been his mentor and inspiration. The familiar faces showed the same mixture of fear and anticipation. Gunnar the smith, whose wife's death had opened his eyes to the value of the old ways. Bjorn the younger, wrestling with divided loyalties. Magnus himself, carrying the weight of a leader who had guided his people to the edge of an abyss. But it was Halla who commanded the most attention as she moved to the center of the circle. Her bundle of healing stones clutched against her chest like a mother protecting her children. The ancient stone in her hand pulsed with soft light, and for a moment the entire assembly seemed to hold its breath. "Before this combat begins," she said, her voice carrying with the authority of one who had earned the right to speak for the forgotten and the dispossessed. "Let all present understand what is truly at stake. This is not a battle between one warrior and another, but between 2 visions of what it means to be strong." She held up the glowing stone so that all could see it clearly. "This represents the strength that builds and heals, that protects the vulnerable and nurtures the young. It is the strength of the mother defending her children, of the healer sitting with the dying, of the warrior who knows that his sword serves something greater than his own glory." Then she pointed toward Thorvald's magnificent blade, its runes gleaming with promised violence. "That represents the strength that takes and destroys, that measures worth by what it can conquer and judges value by what it can possess. It is the strength of the predator, beautiful and terrible, but ultimately hollow because it serves only itself." The contrast hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Ulfgrim felt the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down upon his shoulders. In his hand, the simple iron blade of his ancestors seemed to warm within a fire, while the healing stone pulsed against his palm like a second heartbeat. Thorvald raised his magnificent sword in salute, the gesture mocking despite its formal correctness. Pretty words from a witch who will watch her protector die for her heresies. When this blade drinks Ironjaw's blood, perhaps these simple folk will finally understand that beauty and truth belong to the strong. Ulfgrim raised his own weapon in response, but his salute was offered not to his opponent, but to Halla, to the village that had become his home, and to the memory of the angry boy who had learned the difference between strength and brutality in a humble cottage at the world's edge. "Then let us discover," he said quietly, "which of us the gods judge worthy of their favor. The two warriors began to circle each other with the careful precision of predators, their footsteps echoing on the wooden platform while the assembled crowd watched in breathless silence. The afternoon sun slanted through the growing clouds, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with anticipation of the violence to come. In moments, steel would ring against steel, and the fate of an entire community would be decided by the clash of blade against blade, vision against vision, soul against soul. The first clash of steel rang out across the square like thunder breaking over the mountains. Thorvald's magnificent blade met Ulfgrim's simple iron with a violence that sent sparks dancing through the afternoon air, each warrior testing the other's strength and resolve with careful, measured strikes that spoke of years spent perfecting the deadly art of single combat. Thorvald fought with the fluid grace of a man who had turned killing into poetry, his ruined sword weaving patterns of destruction that seemed to blur the line between weapon and dancer. His red hair streamed behind him as he moved, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never doubted his superiority over any opponent. Each cut was placed with surgical precision, designed not just to wound, but to demoralize, to demonstrate the futility of resistance against his consummate skill. But Ulfgrim met every attack with the steady determination of granite enduring a storm. His ancestral blade moved with less flash but greater purpose, each parry and counter-strike grounded in the fundamental understanding that this was not about artistry but about protection. Where Thorvald sought to overwhelm, Ulfgrim sought to endure. Where the false champion pressed for quick victory, the true defender prepared for a longer battle. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the two warriors circled each other on the wooden platform, their boots scraping against the rough planks with each shift of position. Every eye was fixed on the deadly dance unfolding before them. But more than one observer found their gaze drawn to the healing stone that still glowed softly in Halla's hand, its ancient light seeming to pulse in rhythm with the clash of blades. "You fight well for a man defending lies," Thorvald called out as he pressed another series of attacks, his blade singing through the air with lethal intent. "But skill alone cannot overcome the righteousness of my cause." Ulfgrim said nothing, conserving his breath for the battle while his mind worked through the patterns of his opponent's technique. Thorvald was indeed skilled, perhaps the most dangerous swordsman he had ever faced, but there was something hollow at the center of his fighting style, a brittleness that came from measuring worth only by victory, rather than by the values that made victory meaningful. The ruined blade swept in a devastating arc toward Ulfgrim's neck, but the simple iron sword was there to meet it, turning the strike aside with a counter that sent Thorvald stumbling backward. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the false champion's pale eyes as he realized that his opponent was not simply absorbing his attacks, but studying them, learning from each exchange. "Impossible," Thorvald breathed, recovering his balance with practiced ease. "No warrior has withstood my blade for this long. What sorcery protects you?" "No sorcery," Ulfgrim replied quietly, advancing with his weapon held ready. "Only the understanding that some things are worth dying for, and therefore worth living for as well." The words seemed to enrage Thorvald, who launched into a berserk assault that drove Ulfgrim back across the platform with the sheer fury of its violence. The magnificent sword became a blur of motion, each strike powerful enough to cleave through armor and bone, each cut placed with the precision of a master who had dedicated his life to the perfection of death. But as the assault continued, something began to change. Where Thorvald's movements had once been fluid and controlled, they now carried the edge of desperation. Where his attacks had been calculated for maximum effect, they now sought only to overwhelm through sheer volume. The beautiful weapon in his hands remained deadly, but it was wielded now by a man who had begun to doubt his own invincibility. Ulfgrim felt the shift like a change in the wind before a storm. His ancestor's blade seemed to grow warmer in his grip, while the healing stone in his other hand pulsed with increasing brightness. Around the platform, the crowd pressed closer, sensing that the battle had reached a critical juncture where skill alone would no longer determine the outcome. In Halla's eyes, he saw not fear, but a profound sadness, the expression of someone who understood that violence, however necessary, always came at a cost that diminished everyone involved. But beneath that sadness lay something stronger, an unshakable faith that truth would ultimately prevail over deception, that mercy would prove more durable than cruelty. Thorvald's next attack came with the force of a falling tree, his ruined blade descending in an overhead strike that would have split Ulfgrim from crown to sternum. But instead of meeting it directly, the defender stepped aside at the last possible moment, allowing the magnificent weapon to crash into the wooden platform with an impact that sent splinters flying through the air. For a heartbeat, Thorvald was overextended and vulnerable, his balance compromised by the force of his own attack. It was the opening Ulfgrim had been waiting for, the moment when skill and righteousness could converge to determine the battle's outcome. The simple iron blade moved with the swiftness of justice long delayed, its edge seeking not the death of an enemy, but the preservation of everything that made life worth defending. The simple iron blade found its mark with the inevitability of truth, finally spoken. Not a killing stroke, for Ulfgrim had learned long ago that true strength lay in knowing when not to use it, but a precise cut that opened Thorvald's sword arm from wrist to elbow, sending the magnificent ruined weapon spinning from nerveless fingers to clatter against the platform's edge. Thorvald staggered backward, clutching his wounded arm while blood seeped between his fingers. His pale eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been fear, as if he had never truly believed that his long career of victories could end with defeat at the hands of a man defending an old woman's right to heal. "Yield," Ulfgrim said quietly. His ancestor's blade held steady but not threatening. "The gods have rendered their judgment, Thorvald. Your cause has been found wanting." But the false champion's face twisted with rage that burned away shock and fear, leaving only the desperate fury of a man who had built his entire identity on the foundation of never losing. His uninjured hand moved to his belt, closing around the iron collar that had been meant for Halla's neck. "If I cannot have victory," he snarled, raising the collar like a weapon, "then I'll settle for vengeance." He lunged not at Ulfgrim, but at Halla, the iron collar aimed at her throat with the intent to strangle rather than merely shame. The movement was clumsy, weakened by his wound and driven more by spite than strategy. But it carried enough force to threaten the life of an old woman who had never raised her hand against anyone. The crowd gasped as Thorvald's desperate assault unfolded, but Ulfgrim was already moving. The healing stone in his left hand blazed with sudden light as he threw himself between the false champion and his intended victim, his body becoming a shield that absorbed the impact of Thorvald's final attack. The iron collar struck Ulfgrim's chest with enough force to crack ribs, but it was his ancestor's blade that found its way between Thorvald's ribs, driving deep enough to pierce the heart that had never learned to beat for anything beyond its own desires. The false champion's eyes went wide with surprise, then dimmed as the life fled from them like smoke, dispersing on the wind. Thorvald Bloodaxe, who had claimed 37 victories in single combat, who had served foreign masters while claiming to represent his king, who had sought to destroy a community's soul for the promise of gold, collapsed to the wooden platform and moved no more. The magnificent ruined sword lay beside him, its edge already beginning to dull, as if the metal itself had lost faith in its purpose. For a moment, the square was silent except for the sound of Ulfgrim's labored breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the herbs that still hung from Halla's cottage eaves. Then the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding hills. Voices raised in celebration of truth revealed and justice served. But Ulfgrim felt no triumph as he knelt beside Thorvald's still form, his hand moving to close the dead man's eyes with the respect due to any fallen warrior, regardless of the choices that had led to his end. "You could have been great," he said quietly, "if you had learned to serve something larger than yourself." Halla approached slowly, her healing stones glowing softly in the afternoon light. She knelt beside the body and placed one of the ancient stones on Thorvald's forehead, not to heal, for that was beyond any mortal power now, but to ease the passage of a soul that had lost its way in life. "Even the lost deserve mercy in death," she said gently. "Perhaps in whatever comes after, he will find the peace that eluded him in this world." Around the platform, Thorvald's surviving warriors were laying down their weapons in surrender, their faces showing the mixture of relief and shame that comes to good men who discover they have been deceived into serving evil. Magnus stepped forward to accept their submission with the dignity befitting a jarl who understood that mercy strengthened a leader more than cruelty ever could. Eric Ravenhair climbed onto the platform, his young face bright with the understanding that he had witnessed something far more important than a simple duel. "Lord Ulfgrim," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "the old ways and the new, can they not exist together? Can strength and healing, warrior and wise woman, find common ground?" Ulfgrim looked at Halla, who smiled and pressed the healing stone she had carved for him into his palm. Its warmth seemed to flow through his entire body, carrying with it the wisdom of generations who had understood that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to protect what was sacred. "They must," he said, his words addressed not just to Eric, but to the entire assembled community. "For a people who forget how to heal will soon have nothing left worth fighting for." The iron collar lay forgotten on the platform, its dark metal already beginning to rust, as if the very air rejected its presence. But the healing stones glowed brighter than ever, their ancient light promising that wisdom, once nearly lost, could be recovered and cherished by those brave enough to defend it. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in the village square, and autumn painted Ironhold Valley in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the transformation that had taken place within its borders. The platform where Thorvald had met his end had been dismantled, its wood repurposed to build a new addition to Halla's cottage, a larger room where she could teach the healing arts to any who wished to learn. Ulfgrim stood in the doorway of that expanded cottage, watching as Halla instructed a small group of students in the proper preparation of fever-breaking teas. Among them sat Eric Ravenhair, his warrior's hands surprisingly gentle as he ground dried herbs under the old woman's patient guidance. Beside him, Gunnar the smith practiced the delicate art of carving healing stones, his calloused fingers learning to coax meaning from ordinary river rocks. "The key," Halla was saying, her voice carrying the same wisdom that had once guided an angry boy toward understanding, "is to remember that healing begins with the healer's heart. Herbs and stones are tools, but they become medicine only when they carry the intention to ease suffering and restore wholeness." She held up one of her ancient healing stones, its surface worn smooth by generations of use, but still glowing with inner light. "This stone has been in my family for 9 generations, but its power doesn't come from its age or the symbols carved upon it. It comes from the accumulated love of every woman who held it while tending the sick, every grandmother who used it to draw fever from a child's burning skin." Eric looked up from his grinding. "But Mother Halla, what of those who say the old ways are forbidden? That healing should be left to priests and their prayers? The wise priest understands that healing comes from the same divine source, whether we call upon it through prayer or through the knowledge passed down by our ancestors," Halla replied with a gentle smile. "Father Eriksson from the southern settlement visited us last week. He spent 3 days learning to identify the herbs that ease a laboring mother's pain. He said that surely God would not give us such knowledge unless he meant for us to use it in service of his children." Through the window, Ulfgrim could see Magnus approaching along the forest path, his weathered face showing the contentment of a leader whose people had found their way back to harmony. The Jarl had spent the past months carefully rebuilding relationships with neighboring settlements, explaining the truth about Thorvald's deception and reaffirming Ironhold Valley's loyalty to the true High King. "Any word from the royal court?" Ulfgrim asked as Magnus reached the cottage. "Aye, and good news it is," Magnus replied, settling himself on the wooden bench outside Halla's door. "The High King has officially proclaimed his support for healers who work in service of their communities. He even sent a gift, a royal seal that protects this valley's right to practice the old healing arts alongside the new faith." He reached into his cloak and withdrew a silver medallion bearing the royal arms. But worked into the design were symbols that honored both Christian and pagan traditions. It was a masterwork of diplomatic craftsmanship, acknowledging the complexity of a realm where old wisdom and new beliefs were learning to coexist. "There's more," Magnus continued. "The southern lords who hired Thorvald have been exposed and stripped of their coastal holdings. The tribute they once paid us, in fear they now send in friendship, along with requests for our healers to train their own people in the arts of mercy." Halla emerged from the cottage, her arms full of bundled herbs that would soon become medicine for families throughout the valley. At 73 years old, she moved with the careful grace of one who had learned to husband her strength. But her eyes still held the spark of someone who had found new purpose in her twilight years. "The wheel turns," she said, settling beside Magnus on the bench. "What was once hidden must now be shared. What was once forgotten must now be remembered. And what was once seen as weakness," she looked at Ulfgrim, with eyes that held decades of accumulated affection, "must now be recognized as the truest form of strength." In the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the village below, where young ones played games that blended warrior training with lessons about healing. They learned to hold both sword and staff, to understand that protecting their people meant knowing how to mend what was broken, as well as how to fight what threatened them. Eric emerged from the cottage, his hands stained with herb juice and his face bright with the satisfaction of useful work completed. "Mother Halla, the preparations are finished. Will you come to the village tomorrow to help with young Astrid's birthing? Her mother grows anxious." "Of course, child. A new life entering the world is cause for celebration, not fear." Halla rose slowly, her hand briefly resting on Ulfgrim's arm for support. "And you, young wolf, will you carry my supplies as you once carried morning broth?" Ulfgrim smiled, feeling the healing stone she had carved for him warm against his chest where he wore it on a leather cord. "It would be my honor, Mother Halla, as it always has been." As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the little group made their way back toward the village, where cooking fires sent welcoming smoke into the evening air. Behind them, Halla's cottage stood ready to shelter anyone who sought healing, its windows glowing with the warm light of knowledge preserved and wisdom shared. The wooden bowl that had once carried secret kindness now sat openly on Halla's table, ready to serve anyone who needed nourishment for body or spirit. The healing stones were no longer hidden treasures, but teaching tools that would pass their accumulated wisdom to new generations. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the rusted remains of an iron collar served as a reminder that oppression, however fierce, cannot forever suppress the human capacity for mercy. In Ironhold Valley, the old ways and the new had found their balance, and strength had remembered its true purpose, not to dominate, but to protect what was most precious in the human heart.